was a grueling summer the British seamen spent waiting for the day when they could prove their ships in battle. Promise of what the British and Australian ships would do to the Italian fleet if they ever got the chance was shown in the actions off Calabria and against the Bartolomeo Colleoni. British sea power held fast, and across the whole length of the Mediterranean came the convoys from Britain. Not one ship, not one aeroplane or tank, not one man was lost. But on September the 13th, after 3 months of desert sparring, Graziani crossed the Egyptian frontier at Saloum and pushed on 40 miles to Sidi Barrani. Wavell's men fell back, fighting every inch of the way to the base he'd been preparing all summer at Mersa Matruh. Wavell had made this small town of Mersa Matruh Egypt's bastion, and against it Graziani was about to throw the whole of his strength. A grave situation had arisen. How could General Wavell save it? Reinforcements, badly needed, had arrived at last. From Britain, from India, from Australia and New Zealand.
While General Wavell was assembling his reinforced army of the Nile, his seasoned troops were holding the Italians at Sidi Barrani, watching their every move and developing intense harassing tactics. The foremost Italian defensive positions were surrounded by minefields. When there was no way through for our tanks, these mines had to be removed, the work of sappers under cover of mobile guns. The removal of a detonator is a delicate and dangerous job, especially when the enemy is waiting to pick you off. Graziani had erected round Sidi Barrani an elaborate series of perimeter forts. Mactilla on the coast road facing Mersa-Matruh, an inner line which included the two Tumar forts and Point 90, and further west the formidable Fort Nabaiwa. Then there was a gap of about 30 miles to Rabia up on the top of the escarpment. The Italians continually tried to close this gap by building another fort in the middle of it. But General Wavell concentrated his raids here in an effort to keep it open against some possible future offensive. These raids we made were sudden and well-timed, and we were gone again before decisive counteraction could be taken, leaving behind us a mass of twisted metal and burnt-out remains of enemy units we had destroyed, and taking with us prisoners whom we sent back into Egypt, to Mersa-Matruh or to Cairo for interrogation. These prisoners gave us valuable news about their difficulties.
Water is the age-old problem of Egypt. A few miles from the riverbank, the desert begins and stretches right across the African continent. Water might well explain Graziani's long wait at Sidi Barrani. It was Wavell's problem, no less. However highly trained his reinforcements might be, he still needed time for a period of intensive exercises in the thirsty desert conditions in which they would now operate. The army was ready. What of the Air Force? Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Longmore, then Commander-in-Chief, RAF Middle East Command, visited his stations. He told his men that while the air battle of Britain was on, he had not asked for a single machine from home. But now reinforcements were arriving. It was up to them to smash the Italian Air Force. What aircraft was available, despite all the difficulties of desert maintenance, must be kept serviceable for non-stop operations. The bombers must batter the Italian aerodromes and destroy as many aircraft on the ground as possible. Soon the bomber crews were returning from their long-range operations, smashing up convoys, slashing at troop concentrations, destroying barracks and arms dumps, aerodromes, ports, and shipping along the length of the coastline from Bardia to Tripoli, 800 miles west from Egypt. At the same time, devastating raids were expected from the huge Italian bomber force. At the start, in fact, one such large-scale raid was attempted. The new Hurricanes went up and tackled it. The Italians never came back in such strength, and bit by bit, the Royal Air Force blew their smaller formations out of the Egyptian sky and forced the battle back over the frontier. The great Libyan desert was strewn with the wreckage of Italian aircraft. A vast air force had abdicated command of the air to a handful of superior machines and superior pilots. But for General Wavell to succeed in his secret plan, there must be complete cooperation between the three services. What of the fleet? No coastal operation could be. If it refused to come out, well, the British Navy must go in after it. Armistice Day, 1940, was Taranto Day. Two of Italy's most powerful battleships and three of her modern cruisers were out of action. It was the signal for the Army of the Nile to move. And there was another signal. The move must be made at once, for reconnaissance planes had reported that Graziani himself was at last on the point of launching his long-delayed offensive.
We left Meuse-Matruh on the 2nd of December. I was with the heavy tanks, and we had a 100-mile journey between us and the Italians, and we expected to take about a week to do it. There's Sidi Barrani on the coast, with the line of forts covering it. There's Maktila, the two Tuma forts with point 90, then Nabaiwa and Rabia, with the wide Enba gap between. On December the 7th, we had reached this point, Piccadilly, about 12 miles from Nabaiwa. And where were you then, Sergeant Major?
We were with the Armoured Division, operating about this area. Now, this division divided. The part I was with came down slightly south, and we looked after this Rabia place.
That night, we moved forward along this depression and got into position ready for the attack next morning. To smother the noise of our tanks, the Royal Air Force dropped a few bombs and a lot of petrol tins on the camp. The Italians took offense at this and opened up on the plains with all the ack-ack they had. And whilst the shindy was going on, we slipped through and waited for dawn to attack. With the first streak of light, we moved on, alone with our heavy tanks. The infantry were to follow when we had quelled the position. We ran along here on a compass bearing until we could see the shell bursts from our artillery to guide us. They were exploding on the front of the camp here and on the two flanks. Their artillery very quickly picked us up, and they laid down a very pretty barrage as we came along this slope. but it was fine to see how those gunners sat grimly behind their guns, shooting hell out of us as we came thundering up this slope, crashed over the wall and shot them up with our machine guns. The first squadron split into two. One half went along the southern wall and the other half along the north, shooting up the machine gun nests and anti-tank guns along the edge. The second squadron came in through the same gap, went into the center of the camp, and they had the job there of shooting up any odd targets they could find, like generals and headquarters and things like that. That was the time for our infantry. They drove up to within about a quarter of a mile of the camp, jumped out of their trucks, scrambled across the minefield, through the wall, winkled them out, and the camp was ours. By 8:30 in the morning, while some of the Italians were still at breakfast, General Maletti was shot through the head and his men either killed or taken prisoner.
Of Nibiwa, no Battle of Sidi Barrani was possible. No wiping up of the Italian army in Libya. No invasion of Eritrea, Somaliland or Abyssinia. In fact, no collapse of the Italian Empire. The whole show would have been called off and announced as a large-scale tip-and-run raid. We didn't think when we started that we would finish up in Benghazi. I hope you realize that you were making history.
I think it was more a case of history making us. Nibiwa was in our hands, and we could then turn our attention to the other forts. By the way, where was the armoured division then, Sergeant Major?
Well, some of them were up on this Saloum-Sidi Barrani road, attempting to roll up the Italians, who should have been retreating by now if all had gone well. It had. They were.
We'd gone forward then from Nibiwa and attacked Tuma West, which we took by 12:30. Then went on to Tuma Central, which we got by 3:30. Then we left Point 90 to rot. The day following this attack here, we went on to attack Sidi Barrani itself. We put in an attack in the morning and beat them up, and then went in the afternoon and took the town.
By the way, what happened to Point 90?
Oh, we picked a nice Italian officer with plenty to choose from by then, and we sat him on the front of one of our tanks with a big white flag, and we sent him along to the commander to describe what had happened to them in the other camps and to suggest that he surrender. The commander said he couldn't without a fight. What about his honor? So we sent in an attack. They went along, descended on the camp, and their first few shots put out his biggest guns. Up went the white flags, and out they came with their bags packed ready for going. We bunged them off with the rest of the prisoners, and we then had 32,000 of them and 5 generals all in the bag.
The victory at Sidi Barrani allowed Wavell's full offensive to develop. Withdrawing the Indian Division, he sent the Australians ahead with the Armoured Division. All transport and stores followed the advanced units. All forts and isolated strongpoints between Sidi Barrani and Saloum were mopped up, and by December the 17th, British troops entered Saloum and pushed on towards the Libyan frontier. Hellfire Pass, bombed from the air and bombarded from the sea, had been the only route used by the Italians into Egypt and out again. Now, after repairs by British sappers, the This corkscrew mountain road was the main highway for the British entry into Libya. Just across the Italian frontier stands Capuzzo. This fort fell once again into British hands with barely a fight. From Capuzzo, the road leads direct to Bardia. After Sidi Barrani, the two armored brigades changed over, and the fourth came out on top of the escarpment. The other brigade drove 40 miles to the wire during the night, waited the next day, and in the afternoon went a little nearer to it. Then they went through and drove on towards Bardia. Coming up over the escarpment, avoiding the coast road, they skirted the town and its defenses and took up positions in its rear, setting their artillery in place. They sat there throughout the next day and were bombed almost solidly for 10 hours. The Battle of Sidi Barrani had been fought in a sandstorm, and now again the dread wind of the desert was flaying the sand, blotting out the landscape and delaying the pursuit of the demoralized Italians. But all the plans for the attack on Bardia were complete. One section of the port was to be left to the Navy to bombard from the sea. As at Sidi Barrani, the main attack was to come from the Italian rear. The battle was to open with an intense artillery barrage, and the Australians were to follow this up with an assault on the town. Bardia surrendered on January the 5th, together with over 2,000 Italian officers and more than 42,000 men. Bardia had been described by the Italian radio as this bastion of fascism. But the bastion was gone, and the way lay open towards Tobruk. Incessant bombing by the RAF had set oil storage tanks, buildings, and arms dumps ablaze. In the harbor lay the Italian cruiser San Giorgio, still on fire and sinking, a witness to the effectiveness of the British bombers. By January the 22nd, the last strong points in the defense of Tobruk had fallen, and mopping up operations had been almost completed. The fall of Tobruk brought in a further 25,000 prisoners. General Wavell's intention had been to stop at Tobruk. With its strong defensive position and its port, it made an admirable fortress for the forward defense of Egypt, the safety of which was the whole point of the campaign. But the Germans, meanwhile, had swarmed into Italy and Sicily, and it was obvious that they might throw a considerable force into Libya to reinforce their allies. At least there should be as few Italians left as possible to reinforce. And therefore the British divisions were ordered forward again to attempt the complete destruction of Graziani's army.